What's up YouTube? Welcome to my channel. Today I want to dive into the world of basic orchestration. Let's dive in and have a look. So some of you may or may not know, I've been recently diving into the world of music for video games and various other platforms that I don't usually write for. And coming from a background of electronic music, there are a bunch of kind of difficulties that I've kind of had to overcome, or let's just say things that I kind of rely on in terms of sound design and mixing and that kind of thing to hide the fact that maybe my music theory knowledge or my composition skills are just not that good. I think in a world like we are living in at the moment, it's incredibly important for especially DJs and producers to maybe look outside of the world of dance music to make an income, whether it's music for film or various other platforms. I think learning the sort of difficulties to overcome coming from an electronic background might be incredibly powerful for a lot of you guys. So I want to chat about a bunch of these things, and I also want to do a bit of a walkthrough for a bank that I've recently been getting into called the UVI Orchestral Suite. So I think one of the most important factors about getting into the world of orchestration is to kind of change your mindset a little bit from the kind of regular electronic music production mindset, is to think like a composer in terms of what instruments you limit yourself to, using different ways of producing the sounds to get the desired result. A lot of the time in my workflow, I use very strong elements of sound design and modulation and that kind of thing, which you can't really rely on too much in the world of orchestration. You have very limited parameters to work within. So to really put yourself into the mind of the composer and think how he would organize and write a orchestral piece is incredibly powerful. And I think having a bank like the UVI Orchestral Suite is incredibly powerful because you're kind of limiting yourself to what instruments you're, say, allowed to choose. I mean, obviously you can incorporate stuff from other banks and you can incorporate electronic elements if you want to, but I think kind of having a basis of sounds to draw from and inspiration to draw from is incredibly powerful. And on top of that, they're categorized in very kind of meaningful ways in which we would kind of create orchestral music. For example, if we want a pad type of sound, we would most likely go for strings. So anyway, having these confinements and limitations can help you to get to the point a little bit easier. For example, if we want to start working on a bass line or a kind of bass part for the track, there's very limited instruments which we can choose. We've got the bassoons, the upright basses, various other, but very limited to those kinds of instruments which you can do those lower registers. And that brings me to the next point, is to think in terms of like dynamics and humanization and that kind of thing. Is how would you play that instrument, and using MIDI, just the sort of MIDI messages, how would you get the most kind of dynamics out of it? And obviously that's using a lot of different velocities and really spending time to put the detail into each of those MIDI notes and getting it exactly how you want to. Because, and again, another thing that I kind of heavily rely on in my music production is that kind of really fine audio editing capabilities that we have inside Cubase, for example, removing tails of instruments and making certain stabs of loop softer than others and that kind of thing. And that's the kind of thing that I kind of pick up while looping the track over and over time. So one of the major difficulties is for me to kind of get over that indecisiveness and kind of know where I want to go while laying out these kind of MIDI notes and everything like that. Okay, so what I want to do is start sketching out an idea here, and then we can start talking about various aspects to look out for when getting into orchestrating your music for the first time, or trying to sort of up the game, make your orchestration sound a little bit more professional or a little bit more realistic. So there's various ways we could go about this. I think the most important thing to kind of grasp coming from an electronic music background is chords and having melodies that kind of work and sort of move between these chords and that kind of thing. So we could either start with a Cubase chord track and use the various kind of built-in mechanics there that kind of help you create chords a lot easier. But for this kind of thing, because, like I said, it's important to get into the mind of a composer. It's important to remember that most instruments in the orchestra can't really do chords. A lot of them can maybe at maximum do 2 voices, but a lot of them are based at a single voice at a time. So being able to write your chords in a single voice at a time is definitely going to help to improve that kind of like level of humanization in your music. It also gives you the ability to kind of map out how you want the melodies to kind of interact with each other a lot easier. So I got some help with some of the terminology and analogies that I was using in the video, and just wanted to add in a couple of edits here and there just to make things a little bit more concise for you guys. So first of all, big thanks to one of my Patreons, Franz, aka Cosmic Sidekick, for helping me out with this video. I really do appreciate it. I'm going to post links to where you can go check out his music and stuff in the description of this video. I guess in this part, a good analogy would be like a composer sitting in front of a piano trying out different combinations of notes and combinations of melodies and chords before actually deciding how to orchestrate the entire arrangement as a piece, sitting down with a single instrument and figuring out kind of voice by voice how things are going to be structured in entirety. And you'll see a little bit later on, I use a single instrument, one of the UVI all-string ensembles, which is basically like a single instrument with all of the instruments kind of preloaded, which just makes things a little bit easier for this kind of thing. So the UVI Orchestral Suite has various different instruments built in, like I said, but one of the cool things is you've got these kind of all ensembles, which is like all strings or all woodwinds or whatever subsection of instruments there are. And what this allows you to do is it's basically, you know, instead of just having bass in a particular register, cello in a particular register, violins in a particular register, etc., they've kind of laid them across the entire keyboard. So you can just start sketching it out an idea. When you go lower, it plays a bass note. When you go higher, it plays a cello, and even higher, it plays a violin, etc. So just for kind of sketching out ideas and that kind of thing, it's very cool because you can kind of get an idea of how your entire orchestra is going to fit together before breaking it down and doing each element individually. So like I said, we can start sketching it out using chords, or we can start sketching it out voice by voice. If you know your scales and that kind of thing, then you don't necessarily have to do this, but a really nice handy thing inside Cubase is the ability to kind of snap your note editor to a very specific scale. So let's say, for example, we want to write in C minor. So I've selected the C minor scale here, and what we can do is just click this pitch visibility button on. So now it's only showing us notes in the C minor scale. So for those who aren't too familiar with music theory and that kind of thing, you can actually just go in and punch notes in, and they're always going to kind of fit in the scale. That being said, one of the big differences between a sort of pro composer and somebody who's just like a newbie is pro composers often don't snap everything to the scale. They have certain parts which kind of slide between these scales on the chromatic scale, and that kind of adds tension in certain parts and that kind of thing. So that's just something to bear in mind. It's a little bit more advanced, so something that I don't really do that often. So I guess here I should probably be more specific. You know, it's not necessarily like a professional thing to kind of disregard scale completely and to just write in chromatic scale. That's not going to make you sound more professional in any way. I guess the trick that a lot of the pros use is more of a play between different scales and keys to create these different tensions that we wouldn't necessarily usually hear in a single scale. So I guess it's more about kind of knowing all of the rules and kind of knowing how to break them, as opposed to just not having any rules in the first place, if that makes sense. But anyway, let's punch in a scale and just start mapping out an idea for a kind of bass melody, which we can work with here. So a really cool thing to do when creating a kind of melodic sequence to kind of build the tension is to kind of keep with a particular motion. So say, for example, here we're generally moving upwards, and then to kind of create a kind of epic peak of the melodic part or something like that is to kind of repeat that part or put in something that's kind of not expected. Like, for example, here we have a particular rhythm which we've kind of incorporated. So it's ba 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 ba, and then here there's a kind of double of that rhythm, and that kind of starts the kind of break of this momentum. And then here what I want to do is kind of loop this part over to create a bit of tension, and then maybe just change it a little bit here again, so we're kind of expecting it to loop, and then it changes ever so slightly right at the end there. We can kind of resolve this whole melodic part that I've created. Okay, so what I was trying to portray here is the idea of motifs. So the melodic motif is essentially these patterns of movement between notes. They don't necessarily have to stick to particular notes themselves. They can just be like, for example, like an upward motion or a downward motion or a particular pattern in movement that you can move to different notes to create an entire melody. And it's a similar thing with the rhythmic motif, where it's these kind of subsections of kind of rhythmic sequences which you can use to construct an entire melody or an entire sequence. So now what I want to do is, now that I've created a kind of basic melody, to really get this to kind of stand out and to really sound like it's not just samples being played, is we can kind of adjust these velocities ever so slightly. We can randomize it with various parameters and stuff. But anyway, I'm just going to go in here, change it up. The cool thing about this is it kind of gives us a little bit more control. We can draw in where we want these accented notes. But that's something I want to get into a little bit shortly, is to actually purposefully accent some of these notes like much more than some of the other ones. What we can do also is we can highlight all of these and create like gradients where we kind of have this ever so slightly changing pattern but moving upwards in velocity or that kind of thing, or we can, you know, just move them all down a little bit. We can really fine tune the velocities to get the most detail out of the sound. And that's the idea I want to portray here, is to try get as much detail out of each of these voices or each of these layers as possible. And that's how these kind of pro orchestration writers, pro composers get these really big sounding pieces. I want to up the tempo a little bit here. It seems a bit slow to me at the moment. So as I'm listening to this, in my head, I'm kind of placing these accented notes where I think like a big drum could be. And it's this note, this note. So it's the first and then like this one here in between of each kind of progression, which I think like needs that accented rhythm note. So we can highlight all of these notes and we can just increase the amount of velocity on these to give it that kind of accented play, like the person who's playing it is really accenting that note. Okay, so let's take this melodic piece and start constructing chords around the main parts here. So there's some obvious parts here, for example, here, 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 which I think have these kind of like static notes. And then you can see in between there's these leading notes, which kind of lead from one static note or root note to the next root note. Okay, so here I actually got some terminology wrong. I called these leading notes, where in actual fact these are called passing notes. So a leading note refers to the 7th degree of the scale. So in the C minor or C Phrygian scale, the leading note would be the B flat. However, in this idea, what I'm talking about is using notes to lead from one chord to the next, which is actually called passing notes. So I always get confused with this one because you use them to lead from one chord to the next. So that's why I got confused. It's not actually leading notes. What I meant to say here is passing notes. And these parts I think could be really accentuated with some chords, you know, some chord stabs to really give these kind of stabs extra vibrance. So one thing is now, you know, a lot of the time when we start building chords, we're naturally thinking of chords on a piano, you know, being played with a single hand. So our brain starts to put these chords like this, for example. If we want to make a C minor, it's C, D sharp, G. But the real trick to make it sound really, really epic is to actually span out these voices quite a lot. So I'm just going to put in a single note at a time and we can start constructing them, like I said, a single note at a time. But the real trick is to kind of span these notes out, and that gives you more space to move downwards and move upwards without clashing with the lower register, for example, here, if we had started on this G and we wanted to move downwards, then we're already clashing with some of the notes that are in that part. Does that make sense? So this gives us a much more epic sound, but also the ability to move a bit freer, how we are arranging this melody and stuff like that. We can kind of move downwards and upwards and not worry about those voices clashing with each other. Okay, so here I should probably talk a little bit about the concept of harmonic rhythm, which is essentially establishing chord changes at regular intervals. It generally just sounds a lot more natural that way. So that's like once every bar or half a bar or once every 2 bars, whatever fits the pace of the part of music that you're creating. So that's definitely something to think about that I didn't actually mention here, but it's something that I kind of just naturally do. Okay, I've got some ideas sketched out. Let's start splitting this kind of thing that we've made into the various different kind of voices or instruments. I'm not sure if you guys picked up, but here we've got this kind of bass part that switches over to a cello part, which we might not necessarily want because it doesn't have that kind of continuity. So here what I want to do is just duplicate this over to one of the versions here of UVI Workstation. I've loaded up the patch bass vel or bass velocity using UVI Workstation. I just find with these bigger projects, Falcon I think is limited to like 16 ins and outs and that kind of thing, whereas here I've got a lot more than 16 instruments. So UVI Workstation does become a little bit more powerful because you can stack them up exactly how you want them, and routing, well, I'm not going to say it's more powerful, but the routing is just a little bit easier, doing it kind of one by one. But anyway, I digress. So here let's duplicate this over to the bass instrument, and we can remove all of these top parts and we can start focusing on just creating a good bass part. So the orchestral suite comes with various different versions of each instrument. For example, here you've got bass ensemble and bass solo. So obviously the bass ensemble is a recording of an ensemble of bass. However, the ensembles generally have a lot more articulations, which is something I'm going to get to very shortly. So they also sound a little bit different. So I think here what happens is the bass actually moves out of the register of what sounds good in the bass. So it's going to be a little bit hard to control here. So what we can do is we can either think about maybe tuning to a different key other than C, and maybe getting a bit better of a kind of range out of the instrument like that, because I know that the kind of root pitch of string instruments is not necessarily always C. Here, for example, we can go a little bit lower. I think it's B flat is the kind of like what most string instruments are kind of tuned to. Somebody maybe correct me if I'm wrong. So we might be able to get a little bit more range working in a B flat minor. So what we can do is we can actually just transpose this track by 2. Or what we could also do is we could think about, you know, maybe not doing this full melodic sequence on the bass. Maybe we could just do the kind of like accented notes. And then here, for example, I don't know if you guys have picked this up, but this is the octave of this. So it could go down again over here without spoiling the kind of structure of these kind of chords and these voices that we've created. Okay, so another really major point for creating professional sounding orchestration is articulations and using them to kind of create these variances in your arrangement. So what are articulations? So articulations are different ways of playing the instrument, and I'm sure most of you guys know, or if you know about Falcon and the UVI stuff, you know about their kind of key switch system. It's very similar to Native Instruments Contact. I think you can actually do this exact thing with Native Instruments Contact, and you can actually do various things with this. It's actually a very cool technique that I'm going to show you guys called expression maps within Cubase. So here you can see there's a bunch of different key switches or a bunch of different articulations which we can choose from. It helps to know what these mean. Marcato is like sort of transient, but it's kind of halfway between a sustain and a pizzicato, and a pizzicato is a very plucky note, and a sustain is a long kind of smoother note, and there's various kind of in-betweens. Tremolo is that kind of wobbly note that's often used to kind of transition between different parts and that kind of thing, and then there's various kind of effects like glissandos and trills and that kind of thing, which we might use depending on kind of how, where we get in this video. But anyway, I want to show you the power of Cubase's expression map system. So if we open up this MIDI clip over here and we zoom in a little bit, you'll see here I've got this articulations, and we've got ability to, for each note, change whether it's marcato, pizzicato, legato, and all these different things. So inside Cubase's expression map system, we can go and punch in different articulations, much like we would with velocity and stuff like that. So this is really cool. Say, for example, we want very short staccato notes on our accents and then maybe plucks in between. We can do that. So let's just experiment a little bit here, and then I'm going to show you guys how to actually set up your own expression maps and that kind of thing. So how do we create our own expression map? Let's say, for example, go here and open up a MIDI clip, and then over here you'll see this drop-down menu, expression map. If we click expression map setup, it'll pop up a little menu over here, and we can create a new one by clicking this plus icon. We can give it a name. I'm just going to call this blah. And then here, what you can do is create, let's say, for example, a couple of different slots. You can create different types of articulations on each one. So you can choose from various ones that are built in here. You can add your own custom names and that kind of thing. There's various ones built in like staccato and all sorts of, okay, that wasn't staccato, but you know what I mean. Just various things built in here. I'm just going to choose random ones. I'm not going to actually link them, but I'm going to show you guys how to, and then you can always do that for your own sample libraries and all sorts of things like that. So here we create the articulation types, and then over here you create the output mappings for each of these slots. So let's say, for example, the legato key switch is on C1, then you type in C1 over here. And let's say the pizzicato key switch is on D1. It's very, very simple to set up. You can actually do quite advanced stuff using expression maps and various other plugins and stuff if you've got them. But then you can save them and recall them later on down the line. So, I mean, as you can see there, I've got various ones for each of these different UVI, different types of expression maps for the UVI stuff. Another huge thing about creating kind of compelling orchestrations is to have these kind of moving chords and that kind of thing, to kind of have very expressive motion with your longer sounds, your legato sounds. And one really cool thing about these kind of UVI patches is they've got the ability to switch these different types of expressions. So for example, here the velocity is what actually changes the different the levels of expression in this patch, but you can actually quickly switch that over to wheel and then actually draw in using the modulation automation lane, you can actually draw in the type of expression that you want on the sound. So let's say, for example, each time we want these chords to kind of like fade in and then fade out again, and then slowly fade in and then fade out again. So we can create these kind of really expressive chord arrangements by using automation. So here I want to talk a little bit about the concept of phrasing. So this is essentially similar to like stringing a sentence together of words, you know, where in the sentence you want those words to have the most impact. So I guess good phrasing is identifying, you know, what is the most important part of that bar or of that, you know, particular piece, and using elements to kind of accent that particular part. So in this example, you can see I'm using those kind of string swells that accent that particular part and then swell back a bit. And that is like creating that kind of like rhythmic phrase that creates that important moment, for lack of a better explanation. I think the rhythm of the bass is off. I think it should accent these ones, not every second one, if that makes sense. Something like this. Boom, boom. Okay, so here I should definitely mention syncopation, but for this one I'm going to go straight to what Google says, because it's a little bit complex to explain, but once you've kind of read it, it just makes things a little bit easier. Syncopation in music is the displacement of regular accents associated with given metrical patterns, resulting in a disruption of the listener's expectation and the arousal of a desire for the re-establishment of metric normality. So basically what it's saying in layman terms is syncopation is shifting things slightly to create a slight unexpected result. It kind of creates excitement in the listener to resolve back to a regular interval. So here I was shifting these notes to kind of get a slightly more syncopated rhythm that's not so on the accent. Okay, let's start adding in some epic percussion here. So I want to start it with the kind of big bass percussion instruments like the taikos, timpanis, and the grand kassa, and just start layering in some of these accent notes where I know those like big, you know, the bass notes are, and I can kind of start adding in other rhythms in between. Okay, we're working with percussions now, so I can actually turn the layer, the scale fold off. So this timpani has hits and it's got a roll, and you use the key switches to actually switch between them. But instead of setting up a expression map just for a very simple thing like this, we can actually just use the notes. So C0 and D0. So for example here, I've got the timpani roll at the end here. If we just trigger a D0 at the same time as that, and then a C0 every other time, then it can switch between those different key switches. So we can do like timpani hits here. We can do timpani hits and then switch to the roll and then back to the hits. Another really cool trick is to kind of break the grid a little bit and add in kind of subdivisions or polyrhythms. Let's say, for example, here we've got these drums on a like very regimented grid, but we want to maybe create our own kind of slight rolls with the sound. We can set this over to 1/16 triplets, and this breaks the grid a little bit because we've been kind of working in 16ths the whole time. But this is cool for just quick accents here and there, where you want to just create these little bits of variations, you know. This might not always work. You can try various different other time signatures depending on kind of what you have like written in the track already. So let's just see how this works. So again, here is an example with these snares of how I'm trying to kind of create this break in the grids. Here I've got some rolls. These notes are triggering rolls, and then a kind of like roll over here to kind of like break that grid a little bit. And you can see I've done quite a lot of work with these velocities to kind of get each one to sound a little bit different. So I think these strings could be a little bit more staccato. Let's maybe change the way that we've kind of created this like movement in with the expression. I wasn't too happy with where that was going, so I figured I wanted to take some time off and really kind of work on the finer details and really kind of you know, do the stuff that I'm explaining in the video, but to the nth degree, to kind of really nail down the point. And there was a couple of things that I felt like I would just be auditioning and trying stuff over and over again until coming up with a kind of good thing. So I figured I would do that offline, you know, while you guys aren't watching me bang my head against the wall looking for notes that work and that kind of thing. So anyway, I want to show you guys a couple of things that I've added here. I added a couple of rhythmic differences. I felt like the main accent rhythm that I had created previously was a little bit too regimented. So I kind of wanted to break it up a little bit with a kind of sub-rhythm type thing going on. I created a different part, so it kind of leads into both a key change as well as like a kind of different rhythmic part. So we've got like movement throughout the piece between several different parts, which I think is obviously different, which is obviously, you know, important with this type of songwriting and that kind of thing. We want multiple different parts to kind of tell a story or a journey or something like that. So I added in these kind of rhythmic differences, as you can hear, which I'll show you shortly, as well as these kind of string passes. So what this is what I've done here is just kind of design a pattern. Now, I didn't really design it. This is a kind of well-used thing in classical music, is a kind of like up twice, down once, up twice, down once kind of thing. So it goes 1, 2, 3 down, 1, 2, 3 down, 1, 2, 3 down. And if you do this kind of like in scale, it creates these really nice, what they call string passes. I'm going to just solo this and show you exactly what it sounds like just on its own. So that stuff really adds tension and movement into transitions and that kind of thing. It's almost similar to like what we know in EDM as like rises and that kind of thing, where you really bring up the harmonic kind of color towards the end of a bar before you transition into a new part. It's like really rising that tension. And these kinds of things are really nice ways of being able to do that. So altogether, this is what we're dealing with so far. Here's one thing I wanted to show you guys as well that I think I may have forgotten is how I've done this kind of choir thing. As you can see, the chord structure is pretty much the same. It repeats. But how I've kind of transitioned it or kind of raised the tension throughout that like bar of music is to slowly introduce the degrees of the chord over time. So as you can see, it kind of just starts as a melody for one bar, and then the second bar it adds the second degree of the chord. Okay, another terminology, oopsie. So apparently there's no such thing as degrees of a chord. The term degree apparently refers to steps in the scale and not different notes in the chord. The correct terminology here would have been the third of the chord or the fifth of the chord, and then the third degree of the chord, and so on. And that's a nice way of being able to kind of add a kind of slowly rising tension with just very simple tricks. And another really nice way of creating this tension, so just forget that the string pass is here. Let me just mute this for now. Actually, I think there's another part where there's a violin string pass here as well. So basically, this bar that we're listening to after this key change here, and another terminology, oopsie. So here I said key change, where in actual fact I meant chord change. So there's no key change happening. The scale or the like key of the track doesn't change. It's just those chords which are playing change, but they still remain within the key or the kind of scale which I've chosen for the track. So there's no key change happening. It's just a chord change. Is this long? It's four measures long, but I don't know if you guys picked up at the end of this bar, it repeats that very last segment again. And that's a really, really nice way of being able to add tension, again, with really, really simple tricks. And that just kind of like builds that like building energy at the end of a bar by just repeating that last segment again. And then even more so to kind of like really, really nail in that point, I just added these string passes on top. So I want to show you what it sounds like with and without these string passes here at the end of this bar. So that's obviously the kind of variation part, or the B section, whatever you want to call it. And then that leads in again to this part, which I created with that key change. So this leads back into this as like a repeat of this part over here. But I removed the choirs here. Actually, there, I haven't. And I wanted to put in a melody here. And I wanted to talk about a couple of ideas that we can use to kind of create more compelling melodies. Okay, so I've written a melody here. Considerably happier with this one than the previous version, which I've probably edited out of this video now. Still not the greatest example, but something I wanted to kind of point out here is how important it is to kind of write your melodies to fit, to coexist with each other. So here I've got, you can see there's kind of like two melody lines here in this one MIDI clip. this kind of top line and this bottom line here. So the idea is to kind of leave space with each one for the other one to kind of work and still try to write them so that they can exist on their own, but still better kind of together as a group. So I generally, like with this type of thing, I'll usually just use a piano plugin just because it's kind of like full range. We don't have to worry about register and that kind of thing. And then I'll just kind of like start punching in these notes and trying to find something that kind of like works, you know. So here, let me just show you quickly this example. So obviously the piano doesn't fit there, and that brings me to the kind of next point I want to talk about, is that instrument choice is very much probably one of the most important things. You know, if you're going for a dark and moody kind of sound, you don't necessarily want to use, for example, brass and trumpets and stuff that's going to sound particularly bright. So strings generally tend to portray a very nice moody atmosphere, as well as choirs and that kind of thing. So maybe what we can start doing here is start looking at creating this melody using the choir, because we've removed it in this part. You know, rather than adding more instruments and stuff into the mix, we can start to use stuff that we've already got and just kind of move it in the arrangement into different parts, into different kind of variations and that kind of thing. So here what I want to do is I'm just going to copy this little melody that I've created. Let's maybe create two layers. I've got a females and a males choir loaded up here. So we can maybe do this kind of lower part on the male choir and then the higher part on the female choir. Let's just see how this works. Another thing to really get like super realism out of these things is to, like, for example, here you can see I've kind of drawn in these modulation patterns on all these brass sounds, and that's to really get that kind of sound that it's being blown and not just like a static kind of triggered note. Trying to get it to sound like it's actually being blown out of a horn instrument or something like that. So check this out. I'm just going to copy this across here, and we can draw in our own modulation patterns to try and explain what I'm talking about. Makes a huge difference, eh? Okay, now I want to have a bit of a closer look at the UVI Orchestral Suite itself and show you guys the kind of different types of tweakability, I guess you could say, in each of the different kind of subsections of instruments. For example, like the percussions have various different, envelope settings and that kind of thing, and different ways of doubling up the sound. Whereas like the strings have other things like tremolos and all sorts of stuff to fit that specific category of instrument, which is pretty interesting. So I want to show you guys the wealth of different kind of tweakability that we have in the sound, on top of the articulations and that kind of thing, which I was explaining. We can still automate this kind of thing and all sorts of stuff like that. Okay, I need to fix the articulations and velocities and stuff in that section. But yeah, like I said, it's the details that make these kind of things really, really pop. Anyways, that's about all that we have time for today. I hope you guys enjoyed that. Let me know what you think in the comments. A big thanks to UVI for sending me this pack for the purpose of this video. If you guys like it, let me know in the comments. If you like this kind of thing, let me know in the comments. I'd dig to know, what type of stuff you guys want to see more of. So yeah, let me know. See you guys next time. Cheers.